Hello and welcome, our viewers. This is Tigray Television English Program Service. I'm Ladan Tejano with today's news. Here are the details. Tigray External Affairs Office issued a briefing on Saturday where it called the humanitarian situation in Tigray is bleak. The briefing indicated that more than a month into the humanitarian truce, just 4% of the required aid had reached Tigray. The office says the international community has become complicit in the suffering of millions in Tigray by failing to take decisive action to compel the Ethiopian government to fulfill its legal obligations under international humanitarian law. For more, Abil Zagawa reports.
Tigray External Affairs Office issued a briefing on Saturday highlighting the overall humanitarian situation in Tigray. The briefing said the humanitarian situation in Tigray remains bleak as just 4% of the total aid required has reached Tigray even after the declaration of humanitarian truce by the Ethiopian government. It also said the international community has become complicit in the suffering of millions in Tigray by failing to stop Abiy Ahmed's regime from using starvation as a weapon of war. The office warned the international community to stop praising the Ethiopian government for empty promises and instead put sufficient pressure on the government to allow sufficient aid into Tigray before millions perish from starvation and easily preventable disease. The office said ensuring unfettered humanitarian access into Tigray, lifting the siege and restoring essential services, and the immediate withdrawal of invading Amhara forces from western Tigray and Eritrean forces from Tigrayan territory and holding Eritrean government accountable for Tigray's multifaceted crisis is the only path forward.
Protests erupt across the nation after an armed group in the city of Gondar opens fire on civilians attending the funeral of a prominent sheikh in the city. Thousands were seen protesting across the nation, including the capital, Addis Ababa, Jimma, and Borana. The violence in Gondar saw the death of at least 21 civilians and the destruction of 5 mosques and multiple Muslim-owned businesses. The region's head of security has announced a curfew in the city that restricts movement after 7 p.m., in addition to restriction on carrying weapons in public places. For more, Sarah Kallali has the details.
Violence in Gondar earlier this week has sparked nationwide protests, with demonstrations held in Addis Ababa, Warabe in the Siltei zone, Jimma and Borana in the Oromia region, and Wollo in the Amhara region. Protesters called for the disarmament of the Fano, a paramilitary group in the Amhara region, which is known to be responsible for grave violations of human rights in western Tigray. Initial violence in the city of Gondar that had taken the lives of 21 civilians spread into neighboring areas, with armed groups in Dabarak, 100 kilometers from Gondar, burning 2 mosques and killing 2 civilians, according to Regional State Islamic Affairs Council. Retaliatory attacks in Siltei, in the region of southern nations and nationalities, burned 2 churches and 1 monastery in the area. The Amhara Regional State Peace and Security Bureau announced that it had arrested 373 people in relation to the violence in the city of Gondar. Desalegn Tasso, head for the bureau, also announced a curfew that would restrict movement in the city of Gondar after 7 p.m. Restrictions also include a ban on carrying weapons in public spaces. Violence against civilians had been rampant in Gondar since 2018, when the Fano attacked civilian Tigrayans, killing many and displacing close to 20,000.
43 members of the United States Congress signed a letter addressed to President Joe Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Thursday, requesting for the issuance of an 18-month designation of temporary protected status for Ethiopians fearing persecution in their country. The temporary protected status would mean that the United States would not return any person from Ethiopia that faces serious risk to their lives and freedom. The congressmen and women emphasized that the United States government was yet to issue the temporary protected status regarding Ethiopia, despite the more than 18 months of long conflict that has seen sexual violence used as a weapon of war and close to 1 million people living in famine-like conditions. Stating concern that majority Black and African countries are rarely prioritized for the designation process. For more, Salome Takhlai reports.
43 members of the United States Congress issued a letter to President Joe Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Thursday, requesting the issuance of an 18-month designation of temporary protected status for Ethiopia. The temporary protected status would mean that the United States would not return any person from Ethiopia that faces serious risk to their lives and freedom. The congressmen and women emphasized that the United States government was yet to issue the temporary protected status to Ethiopians, despite the more than 18 months long conflict in Ethiopia. The members of Congress noted that the war on Tigray had seen the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, the destruction of infrastructure, and noted that more than 900,000 people in Tigray find themselves in famine-like conditions, saying Ethiopia was witnessing the worst drought in 40 years. The members said that the United States must not return anyone to such conditions and urged for the designation of the TPS for Ethiopia immediately. The members of Congress said that the designation of TPS for Ethiopia could help in creating stable conditions for families and communities. The letter also emphasized that it may have a deterrence effect by setting an example for the world on human rights, while aiding people and families in countries amidst conflict. While appreciating the work of the United States in designating TPS for Ukraine and Afghanistan, the members called on providing the same protection for the people in Ethiopia and expressed concern that majority black and African countries usually fail to be designated despite clear concerns in their home nations.
The war on Tigray has been characterized by its destructive nature, reversing decades of progress in healthcare provision, expansion of education and infrastructures, and concerted efforts towards land rehabilitation and environmental protection. This, in addition to the discontinuation of basic services and the blockade of all essential goods and aid, has put more than 80% of the population in crisis. The impact it has had in reversing gains Tigray has made to improve food security in the region is even more devastating and may have a decades-long impact. For more, Sablor Lama has this report.
The famine of 1980s in Tigray and other parts of northern Ethiopia was one of the worst humanitarian events of the 20th century, prompting a global response to bring in food assistance. According to United Nations, Ethiopia's food shortages and hunger crisis from 1983 to 1985 led to an estimated 1 million famine deaths. Millions more were displaced and left destitute, without resources to rebuild their lives.
Dawn. And as the sun breaks through the piercing chill of night on the plain outside Korum, it lights up a biblical famine, now in the 20th century. This place, say workers here, is the closest thing to hell on earth.
There's no point in fighting if the people are finished. This is the saddest time in my life.
The humanitarian catastrophe at the time was largely a result of centuries-long policy that neglected rural communities and their development. The military junta that led Ethiopia at the time, the Derg, would view the famine as an opportunity to quash the rebellion brewing in the region, bombarding Tigrayans attempting to flee to Sudan and re-invading the region while denying aid to the millions of civilians in dire need. The longest-serving Ethiopian foreign minister and high-ranking member of the Tigray People's Liberation Front recalls that period as being one of the most challenging in his life.
بر تدرقوا حمدنا لحساس قيد حزب نفرتنا خد كتقطقطو ما قد رخينا لنا بإرترا نوصو شعبي محلاف قليلنا أفدق السودان مسوصحو أفدق كسلا ما قد 4 ساعات تراي مسترفو أقري حقيتهم نفرت مسيان كتكتابنا أرقفهمنا كم حبرات سوى كنبر يخل دي ينبرني تحطو كم تقراوايز والحبرتسب كله قدمنا
ناب 300 شي حزبي كاب 60 كساب 80 معلتي بأجر እንዳተጓዓዘ ለይቲ ቀጥሪ ተሓቢኡ ውዕል ምክንያቱም ሚጋት ናይ ደርጊ መጽን ይዱድኦ ነይረን ስለዚ ቀጥሪ ተሓቢኡ ውዕል ለይቲ ብጸልማት ግን ደርገፍ እንዳገበረ እንዳበለ ሱዳን ከድ ጌርና.
The humanitarian crisis was a wake-up call for leaders of TPLF that understood that failing to respond to food insecurity challenges at their core would have a catastrophic impact for Tigrayans that faced famine every decade. The front, along the Relief Society of Tigray, would mobilize communities in rural areas to restore degraded land and address environmental challenges in liberated areas in Tigray.
The Department of Agriculture developed a strategy that the key intervention should be the natural resource conservation, that is soil and water conservation and protection of forests, working for rehabilitation of degraded mountains and hills. So this is the major reason why natural resource conservation became an important strategy in Tigray.
The successor to the Derg, Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Front, a four-party coalition that included the TPLF, would adopt the conservation policy of the TPLF nationally. But the work in Tigray would continue at an aggressive rate, with more than 400,000 hectares of degraded land in Tigray restored. This massive investment to address environmental degradation in Tigray would pay off with the restoration of degraded mountains and landscapes and improvement of the living condition of farmers across the region. The once poverty-stricken region became a symbol of change, restoration, and improvement of life conditions of its population, as the impacts of drought on livelihood of farmers were significantly reduced. Tigray's remarkable achievements in participatory land restoration would come to win the Future Policy Gold Award in 2017, the only award which honors policies rather than people on an international level. While China and Brazil won Silver Award, countries such as Australia, Jordan, and Niger won Bronze Award for their policies and effort to protect the environment.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this year's Gold Award goes to Africa, the continent most severely impacted by land degradation. Ethiopia's Tigray region has made remarkable progress in restoring degraded land and improving food and water security. For its mass mobilization of people and its outstanding achievements under harsh conditions, Tigray's policy is celebrated with the Future Policy Gold Award 2017.
But recent findings by international and national study groups would find that much of these gains in restoration have been reversed. A recently published article by Conflict and Environment Observatory would indicate that the disruption of essential services to Tigray by the Ethiopian government, especially electricity, leading to a higher dependence on wood, has significantly reduced vegetation. The organization would use satellite imagery from now and before the start of the war on Tigray to show the devastating impact. In his most recent interview with Tigray television, Professor Mitiku Haile, a leading expert in environmental protection, says that Tigrayans may have lost more than 30 years of concerted efforts to rehabilitate land and increase the quality of livelihood.
And we have measured it at the ground level, and in some places even increased the livelihood of people, improved the livelihood, and then in terms of, particularly with honey production, with small-scale irrigation and whatnot. So these are, the concerted efforts of improving the environment, improving the landscape, and then putting it into crop production. Now, what has been done through all these years, because of the war, most of the watersheds are, which were really rehabilitated. The information that I have, as an aspect of some studies made on the damage, and also through satellite images that we have obtained, quite a lot of land degradation, particularly cutting off indigenous trees.
Professor Mitiku also added that sustainability can be ensured if the aid coming from the international community can ensure that sustainable development programs and technological support is added.
We are requesting the international community to see to it that with all what the farmers are doing, in having, crop productivity enhancement activities, we are demanding that along the humanitarian aid, The international community has to say, yes, farmers of Tigray need inorganic fertilizer and chemicals to, increase their productivity and come out of, the syndrome of humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid can be in place, but if we cannot sustain the next crop production to a higher level, then there would be a perpetual hunger, perpetual starvation, and deaths of people and children, particularly of malnutrition.
After decades of efforts to eradicate food insecurity, more than 80% of Tigrayans find themselves in dire need of humanitarian assistance. More devastating has been the world's silence amidst a catastrophic humanitarian situation that may see millions dead.
The distraction on health facilities in schools has been one of the most deliberate and most comprehensive, taking Tigray health and education systems back to decades. We visited Mike Nuttall's secondary school in central Tigray and found the compound, once a place of hope, now in complete shambles. For more, Abraha Gabretinsai has the details.
Mike Nuttall Secondary School, based in the town of Mike Nuttall, Central Tigray, was constructed by an NGO called A Glimmer of Hope in collaboration with Tigray Development Association. However, it was fully destroyed by the Ethiopian and Eritrean forces last year. Getu Addisu, principal of the school, says the invaders have looted and vandalized the school, causing nearly 6 million birr loss in total. According to the school principal, the invaders have looted 12 plasma televisions from the school alone.
As you can see, this was our plasma center. We had 12 plasma televisions in this school. 4 of them were in the store as they were newly purchased. These plasma TVs were helpful in providing technology-assisted teaching and learning process, but all of them have been taken by the invaders.
Getu also says the invading forces have completely destroyed a laboratory block, burning all the materials inside it. He says the destruction was severe as all the chemicals, models, chairs, tables and other essential laboratory equipment were burned.
This was laboratory block. It used to contribute a lot to the teaching and learning process before the war. There was different laboratory materials and chemicals used for physics, chemistry as well as biology classes. It was providing essential support to students' learning, but it's fully destroyed as the enemies burned it. The fire lasted for a day and a half. Everything inside it, including chemicals, models, and chairs, have been demolished. More than 7 microscopes were also burned there. This severely affects the quality of education in our school.
The school principal also added that the invading forces have made the main store of the school completely out of use, looting and vandalizing more than 1 million birr worth equipment as well as education materials, including sports equipment, computers, and photocopy machines.
This was main store of the school. All newly purchased equipment was stored here. There were computers and photocopy machines that have been destroyed by the invaders. There were also different sport materials here, including 97 sports shirts, 36 pairs of sports shoes, and 66 different kinds of balls. All these have been taken by the Ethiopian and Eritrean soldiers. Especially Eritrean forces have taken many of the materials from this store. They have also destroyed the remaining ones. All kinds of stationery materials like pen, papers, chalk, and book have been looted and vandalized here. Our school encountered more than 1 million birr loss in total in this main store alone.
Mike Nuttall Secondary School is one of the schools that have faced a devastating damage where over 85% of classrooms were partially or fully damaged and 60% of textbooks and 85% of laboratory equipment have been either looted or destroyed by invading forces, according to a preliminary assessment conducted by the Regional Education Bureau in collaboration with local and international NGOs in August of 2021.
This week, the world marked International Immunization Week by vaccinating citizens in masses, worked on increasing vaccine confidence and coverage. While here in Tigray, the termination of vaccines threatens the lives of millions, as the Ethiopian government's blockade on all medical supplies, including vaccines, continues. For more, Saron Zakai reports.
April marks International Immunization Week, bringing together partners from across the world to
to promote the use of vaccines that protect people of all ages against diseases. Spearheaded by the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, and the World Health Organization, the theme for this year's World Immunization Week is Long Life for All. This year's theme highlights the immense historic achievement of vaccinations across the globe. For over 2 centuries, vaccines have helped protect children and adults from serious and deadly diseases. Vaccines are among the most advanced achievements of modern science, decreasing by half infant mortality and saving millions of lives throughout the world. Despite their vital nature, vaccines, like all other medical supplies, have been barred from reaching Tigray, with an estimated 200,000 children in Tigray said to have missed their vaccine shots this past year. Last year, the World Health Organization warned that the war on Tigray and the consequent disruption of health services could lead to the spread of deadly diseases. The WHO stated that from January to November of 2020, over 400 cases of measles in children were reported, and that with disruption to route vaccination, this number may increase significantly in the near future. Over 9,000 cases of malaria were also recorded, and when compounded with malnutrition, fatality due to malaria among children can increase up to 3-fold. But one of the most highly affected members of the community are IDPs, with more than 2 million internally displaced persons living in overcrowded facilities across the state and have no access to clean water or proper nutrition. Dr. Sofanias Malako and his teammates at Maadot have been working to ensure that IDPs have access to free and equitable health care.
Through our work, we were able to provide free health care to almost 300,000 IDP throughout Tigray. And we've been able to provide a service to our people in need.
Dr. Sofanias says the most widely spread communicable diseases are infectious respiratory diseases such as COVID-19 and tuberculosis, acute diarrhea, scabies, and not to mention sexually transmitted diseases. The collapsing health system, according to Dr. Sofanias, makes the situation even worse, allowing the disease to spread faster and more widely.
We don't have medications. The diseases are getting more complicated and difficult. We could have managed them months back. We can still manage them now if we act promptly.
Dr. Sofanias emphasized that conflict-affected areas are potential hot zones for the emergence or resurgence of old and rare diseases, and says he fears that if the world doesn't take decisive action to curb current trend in Tigray, the situation could present a threat for global health.
So imagine the world as one small village where you'd have different houses. Some are flimsy and small, some are very big and nice looking, but they're all connected by narrow corridors. So if you have a fire that would erupt in the small and flimsy house, the people of the neighborhood or the village would be wise to put it out, right? Because that fire does not stop there. Fire is contagious and it will consume everything around it. So let's look at this disease as that fire. We are allowing this disease to fester here, and we are not looking at them as we should. And neglecting to act now and ignoring the suffering of the people here will be ignoring the suffering in the world for the future, because these diseases will spread.
Dr. Sofanias called on the world to be on the right side of history by helping save the lives of millions in Tigray being denied access to health care.
This conflict is going to pass. We're going to forget about it someday. But history will not forget who did what and how we acted. And we should all stand in the right side of history. And we should not accept human suffering.
According to the World Health Organization, close to 4 million people in Tigray are in urgent need of medical care, as the Ethiopian government continues to block the delivery of urgently needed aid into Tigray.
For 10 months now, civil servants in Tigray have not received their salaries. After decades of services, these civil servants find themselves on the brink of unable to care for themselves or their families. We spoke with Maqala University staff, one of the public universities found in Tigray, funded by the federal budget. The employees find themselves exposed to a severe risk of starvation as the Ethiopian government withholds their salaries and blocks them from accessing their savings. For more, Mira Romana has the details.
It's now been more than 10 months since the Ethiopian government discontinued the budget of federal institutions in Tigray, including 4 publicly funded universities. This has not only discontinued education for thousands of students, but its employees who have faithfully served the university have not been given their salaries. We visited Ma'ala University and spoke to some of its employees, who say that despite having served for decades, they now find themselves unable to cover for basic cost, having to go without so much as 1 meal per day.
The federal government has neglected us for 9 months now. Even before, our wage was very small, but now we don't even have our salaries. We are in a very difficult situation.
We are in a terrible situation because of the siege. The crisis has reached its peak.
I don't own anything. I rent my home. I don't receive help from anyone. I don't even have relatives. The women say that at the start of the siege, they got by through the support of others. But now, everyone finds themselves in a similar position, unable to support others.
People have survived by helping each other, and until now we had made it with the support of others. But now, things are getting worse for everyone.
The women stated their frustration that the international community is yet to take a strong stand on the situation in Tigray and work towards ensuring Abiy Ahmed's government restores basic services and ends its blockade on aid.
The Ukraine war started recently, but they are getting all the attention. But when it comes to us, they do nothing but state their concerns.
We need the world to help us. We need to know that we will get as much attention as other conflicts. It has been 10 months since the federal government frozen the banking accounts of Ma'ala University, and thousands of its academic and supportive staff have been destined to starve with their family members. It's also to be recalled that the university has officially announced that 3 of its staff members have died of starvation, and thousands of others are languishing from hunger.
Alliance of Civil Society Organizations of Tigray, Tigray University Scholars Association, Ma'ala University organized a workshop on the role of national and international state actors on the war on Tigray. Participants emphasized that while international non-state actors had played a significant role in bringing to light atrocities in the ongoing conflict, they have so far failed to bring about meaningful action to end the crisis. For more, Abil Zagabu has the details for us.
Alliance of Civil Society Organizations of Tigray, Tigray University Scholars Association, Ma'ala University Human Rights Center and Ma'ala University Legal Aid Center held a workshop on the important role of local and international non-state actors can play, saying that while international non-state actors played an important part in bringing to light the atrocities in Tigray, they had failed to bring about meaningful action.
Well, the conference was all about 2 things. One was about evaluating the report which was recently given by the Amnesty International and the Human Rights Watch. The other is what did the international community, humanitarian international community's role, So,
the presenters basically presented that the role of these organizations was relatively better compared to the national and local civil society organizations, particularly in exposing the human rights and humanitarian law violations in Tigray. But this doesn't mean that there were not problems.
Dr. Sarah told the Brand discussed the failure of the non-state actors to provide sufficient support for survivors of weaponized rape in Tigray, calling their response wholly insufficient in light of the gravity and magnitude of the violence on women in Tigray.
And they are still speaking. Until today, a lot of these organizations are expressing their concerns, they are advocating, they are trying to mobilize resources, they are trying to intervene, but unfortunately for a Tigrayan woman sitting here and speaking on behalf of her sisters, I am sad to say until today nothing, not one drop of help has been able to come to the women in Tigray. And I would like to say, what are we waiting for? For example, the Human Rights Watch report stated that Tigrayan women who had gone under sexual and gender-based violence are actually double victims because of the siege. And it's 5 months since that report came out, and the siege hasn't changed. And international actors, national actors, and even at the Tigray region level actors are unable to go and help any of these women because of the siege. I'm not just saying the siege needs to change. I'm saying everything needs to change. The way this is happening, it shouldn't happen in Tigray, it shouldn't happen in anywhere in the world. This has to stop.
The civil society organizations also discussed the recent report by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and the decision of these organizations to designate Western Tigray a contested area and a failure to name what had unfolded in Tigray by its name, a genocide.
The report, it was a shouting report, but it shouted about the atrocities, but it failed to name the atrocities by its very name, by genocide.
While they investigated so much the human rights and humanitarian violations in Tigray, their conclusion was very much reductionist, because generally when we read the facts narrated in the reports, basically we can conclude that these facts can lead us that genocide has already happened or committed in Tigray, but they didn't put it like that.
Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch had issued one of the most extensive reports on atrocities in Western Tigray that had led